Part 1. The Last Morning. June 7, 1692. It is a Tuesday morning in the Caribbean. The sun is already high. The air is thick and salt-heavy. In the harbor town of Port Royal, Jamaica, merchants are opening their shops. Sailors are sleeping off last night's rum. And somewhere in the mud of a busy street, a man is checking his pocket watch. The time reads 11:43 a.m. Then the ground moves, not gradually, not with warning. In seconds, the earth beneath the city, loose sand packed with brick and bone and centuries of ambition, turns to liquid. Streets open up and swallow people whole. Buildings tilt and slide toward the sea. Entire neighborhoods vanish beneath the harbor in minutes. That pocket watch was found 300 years later, excavated from the mud by marine archaeologists. Its gears have been frozen by the pressure and sediment, permanently stopped at 11:43 a.m., the exact minute that one of the most notorious cities in the world ceased to exist. This is a story of Port Royal, a city built by geography, fueled by greed and erased in 3 minutes. Part 2. Geography. Why this spot? To understand Port Royal, you have to start with a map. Jamaica sits in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, perfectly positioned between the coasts of North and South America, directly in the path of the massive trade routes connecting the New World back to Europe. In the age of sail, that position was everything. Any ship crossing the Atlantic toward the Americas would pass within reach of Jamaica. Any cargo moving between Spanish colonies on the Pacific coast and the markets of Europe had to navigate these waters. On the southern coast of Jamaica, a long, narrow spit of sand, barely a kilometer wide, juts out into the sea, curving like a finger to form one of the deepest natural harbors in the entire Western Hemisphere. Ships of almost any size could sail directly in, anchor safely, unload and depart, all within sheltered water. At the tip of that Sandbar sat Port Royal. The geography seemed perfect. Deep water, protected anchorage, a strategic position at the crossroads of Atlantic trade. But underneath the city, that same loose sand that made the spit so easily settle was hiding a fatal flaw, one that wouldn't reveal itself for decades. Part 3. Rise of a pirate capital. In 1655, the English seized Jamaica from Spain. It was a military opportunist prize, a large, fertile island with that extraordinary harbor. But England had a problem. The Spanish Empire still dominated much of the Caribbean, and England lacked the naval resources to defend its new territory properly, so they made a calculated decision. Instead of building conventional military force, the English crown invited privateers, licensed pirates, to operate out of Port Royal. These men would raid Spanish ships and settlements, weaken the empire's grip on the region, and share the plunder with the crown. In exchange, they got safe harbor, legal cover, and the freedom to do almost anything they wanted in port. Port Royal became the privateers' capital. The most famous of them was Henry Morgan, a Welshman who turned Caribbean raiding into something resembling military strategy. Morgan didn't just hit Spanish ships at sea. He sacked entire cities. In 1671, he led an expedition across the Isthmus of Panama and looted Panama City, then the wealthiest city on the Pacific coast of the Americas. He returned to Port Royal a hero, was briefly arrested to satisfy a Spanish diplomatic complaint, and then, in a move that says everything about the era, was knighted by the English crown and appointed lieutenant governor of Jamaica. Port Royal boomed. Wealth from raids, trade, and a thriving black market poured into the city. At its peak, it was one of the largest and wealthiest English cities in the Americas. with a population of around 10,000 people crowded onto a sandbar barely the size of a few city blocks. And with that wealth came everything else. 1 in every 4 buildings in Port Royal was a tavern or brothel. There were more drinking establishments per capita here than almost anywhere else in the English-speaking world. The city was loud, violent, and almost entirely unconcerned with morality. Clergy who visited wrote letters back to England in horror. One minister reportedly called it, and these words stuck, the wickedest city on earth. It was a title the city seemed to wear proudly. Part 4. The Earthquake. By 1692, Port Royal was at the height of its power, and also at the height of its excess. The privateering era was winding down. The English crown, under diplomatic pressure, had begun distancing itself from outright piracy. But the city had already accumulated enough wealth and trade to sustain itself as a commercial hub. Life in Port Royal went on. June 7th began like any other morning. Then, just before noon, the earthquake struck, the fault line running beneath Jamaica, part of the complex tectonic boundary between the North American and Caribbean plates, ruptured without warning. The shaking was severe, but it wasn't the shaking itself that destroyed Port Royal. It was what happened to the ground beneath it. The sandbar on which the city sat was composed of loose, water-saturated sand. When seismic waves passed through it, the particles of sand momentarily lost contact with each other. The ground stopped behaving like a solid and started behaving like a liquid. This is called soil liquefaction, and it is one of the most terrifying phenomena in geology. In seconds, streets that had supported brick buildings and hundreds of people turned to quicksand. Entire rows of houses tilted and sank. People standing in the open were swallowed to their waists, some to their necks, before the ground re-solidified around them. Eyewitness accounts describe crowds of people simply disappearing into the earth, pulled down as if by invisible hands. Then the tsunami came. The earthquake had displaced the seafloor. A wall of water surged into the already collapsing city, pushing buildings that were still standing into the harbor and washing over the ground that had just swallowed its own residents. Within 3 minutes, 2/3 of Port Royal was underwater. 2,000 people died in the initial disaster. Thousands more perished in the weeks that followed from disease and cramped, flooded ruins. The death toll is estimated at around 5,000, half the city's population. And somewhere in the mud, a pocket watch stopped at 11:43 a.m. Part 5. The Pompeii of the Caribbean. Port Royal sank so fast that it became something extraordinary, an underwater time capsule. Unlike most lost cities, which are picked apart by scavengers, eroded by weather, or gradually demolished for building materials, Port Royal went under almost instantly. The mud and sediment sealed it. For centuries, it sat largely undisturbed on the harbor floor, preserving a frozen moment in time. When marine archaeologists began serious excavations in the 20th century, what they found was astonishing. Cast iron cooking pots were still sitting in their hearths, with charred wood from the morning fire still beneath them. Taverns lay intact on the seafloor, their shelves still lined with wine bottles, sealed and unbroken. In one courtyard, archaeologists recovered the clippings from a man's beard, the remnants of a morning shave, preserved in sediment, from a morning that ended at 11:43. It is, in every meaningful sense, the Pompeii of the Caribbean, a city frozen at the instant of its destruction, offering an unfiltered window into 17th century colonial life. Not the official version, not the version presented to kings and courts, but the actual life of sailors, merchants, tavern keepers and their customers, preserved exactly as it was in the final moments of a Tuesday morning. Excavations are ongoing. New finds continue to emerge from the mud. Part 6. Aftermath and Legacy. The survivors tried to rebuild. A new settlement rose on the parts of the Sandbar that had survived, but Port Royal seemed cursed. A devastating fire tore through the rebuilt town in 1703. A hurricane struck in 1722. Disease returned repeatedly. Each time, the city struggled back, and each time, a little less of it remained. Gradually, the commercial and political center of Jamaica shifted. A new city, Kingston, grew on the mainland across the harbor. It became the island's capital, its port, its economic engine. Port Royal shrank to a small settlement of fishermen and dock workers. Today, Port Royal is a quiet village of a few thousand people. There are no grand ruins to visit above ground. The famous streets, the taverns, the pirate quarters, the warehouses full of Spanish silver, all of it is underwater, buried in sediment, slowly being mapped by researchers with sonar equipment and diving gear. The villagers who live there today park their cars in what was once the heart of city that terrified the Spanish Empire. Part 7. A City Remembered. Geography made Port Royal, the deep harbor, the strategic position, the sheltered anchorage. All of it created the conditions for a city to rise from nothing to one of the most powerful and infamous places in the Atlantic world in less than half a century. But geography also unmade it. The same loose sand that made that spit of land so easy to build on was a mechanism of its destruction. The city's greatest asset and its fatal flaw were the same thing, and it took 37 years for that flaw to reveal itself. Port Royal is a reminder that cities are not permanent. They exist in relationship with the ground beneath them, the water around them, the trade routes that flow through them. When any of those things change, suddenly or slowly, cities change with them. Sometimes they adapt, sometimes they don't, and Port Royal didn't. It vanished in 3 minutes, leaving behind a frozen world on the seafloor and a pocket watch that still says 11:43. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, subscribe for more videos on how geography shapes the world we live in and the worlds we've lost.